Every decision you have ever made was determined before you made it, not by fate, not by God, not by some mystical force operating outside the laws of physics, by physics itself, by the exact configuration of atoms in your brain at the exact moment the decision occurred, a configuration shaped by every experience you ever had, every gene you inherited, every meal you ate, every conversation that quietly rewired you without your permission. You didn't choose any of those things, which means you didn't choose. And if that's true, if the neuroscience and the physics are pointing where they appear to be pointing, then everything you believe about yourself is built on a foundation that does not exist. In 1983, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet attached electrodes to the scalps of volunteers and asked them to do something simple: flex their wrist, whenever they felt like it, spontaneously, of their own free will. He asked them to note the position of a dot moving around a clock face at the precise moment they felt the urge to move. The moment the decision arose, the moment, in their subjective experience, that they chose. The results should not have been possible. The brain activity that initiated the movement, what Libet called the readiness potential, the measurable neural buildup that precedes voluntary action, began an average of 550 milliseconds before the movement occurred. That's not the unsettling part. The unsettling part is that the volunteers reported feeling the urge to move an average of 200 milliseconds before the movement, which means the brain had already begun preparing the action 350 milliseconds before the person became conscious of deciding to perform it. The decision was made, then the person became aware of it. Then they believed they had made it. Libet spent the rest of his career trying to find the escape hatch. He looked for evidence of what he called free won't, the capacity to veto an action after the unconscious brain had initiated it but before it was carried out. He found a small window, a fraction of a second in which, theoretically, the conscious mind could intervene and cancel what the unconscious had already set in motion. He held on to that window. Most of the scientists who came after him did not, because subsequent research closed it. In 2008, John Dylan Haynes at the Max Planck Institute ran a version of the Libet experiment using fMRI, functional brain imaging that could observe neural activity across the entire brain simultaneously. He asked participants to press one of two buttons whenever they chose, left hand or right hand, freely, spontaneously. He could predict which button they would press up to 10 seconds before they were consciously aware of having made the choice. 10 seconds. From brain activity alone. Before any subjective sense of decision had arisen. Think about what that means. The outcome of what felt like a free, spontaneous, self-generated choice was encoded in neural patterns that existed before the person had any awareness of choosing, before the story of "I decided" had even begun to form. The feeling of deciding came after. The narrative of authorship, the experience of being the one who chose, was constructed retrospectively and presented to consciousness as if it had come first. But then something stranger entered the conversation. Because Libet's experiment and Haynes's experiment were studying simple motor decisions. Flex a wrist? Press a button? The kind of choice so trivial it barely qualifies as a choice at all. The question that haunted the field was whether the same mechanism operated for the decisions that actually matter. For the choice to end a relationship, to change a career, to forgive someone, to harm someone, to be the kind of person you are trying to be. And here is what the broader neuroscientific literature, assembled across decades of research into decision-making, moral judgment, and behavior, suggests with increasing and uncomfortable consistency. Yes. Every decision you make emerges from neural processes that precede your awareness of them. Every preference you hold is the product of neural architecture you did not design. Every value you claim as your own was shaped by forces, genetic, developmental, cultural, experiential, that operated on you before you were in any position to evaluate or consent to them. This is where everything changes, because this isn't just a neuroscience problem. It's a justice problem, a moral problem, a civilization problem. If the murderer's brain was shaped by genetics they didn't choose, by a childhood they didn't choose, by neurological conditions they didn't choose, and if the decision to kill emerged from the same unconscious neural machinery that generates every other human decision, then what exactly is punishment for? Not rehabilitation, not public safety, not deterrence, retribution. The belief that the person deserved it, that they could have done otherwise. And if they couldn't have done otherwise, if no one can ever do otherwise, then retribution is not justice. It is just more caused behavior dressed up in moral language. And this is the part almost nobody talks about, because the implications don't stop at the criminal justice system. They reach into every relationship you've ever had, every resentment you're carrying, every moment you've judged someone for not being better, for not being kinder, stronger, braver, more disciplined, as if they had, at some fork in the causal chain, simply chosen wrongly. What if they didn't choose? What if you didn't either? But then something strange happened in the research. Scientists began studying what happens to people when they stop believing in free will. The hypothesis was reasonable. If people believe their actions are determined, they'll behave better. Less judgment, more compassion. A recognition that circumstances shape people would naturally produce more understanding, more patience, more forgiveness. The opposite happened. In a series of studies, participants who were primed to disbelieve in free will, who read passages arguing that human behavior is entirely determined, subsequently cheated more, helped others less, behaved more aggressively, showed less self-control. As if the removal of the belief in authorship removed the felt sense of responsibility along with it, as if the story of free will, even if it was a story, was doing something essential. And here is the knife edge the research places you on. The belief in free will may be false. But the belief in free will may be necessary, not because it's true, but because without it, something in human moral psychology collapses, something that no philosophical argument, however correct, has yet found a way to replace. We are, it appears, creatures who need to believe we are the authors of our lives, even if the authorship is, at some fundamental level, a construction. Even if the writer is downstream of processes it did not originate. Even if the self that claims to choose is itself a chosen thing. This was never really about free will. It was about the story of the self as author, the story of the life as chosen, the story that makes praise meaningful, blame coherent, regret possible, aspiration rational, the story that allows you to look at who you are and believe that who you become is still, in some meaningful sense, up to you. That story may not be literally true, but it may be the most important fiction our species has ever produced. The philosopher Daniel Dennett spent decades arguing that free will, properly understood, is not about standing outside the causal chain. It is about being a certain kind of node within it, a node that responds to reasons. That can be influenced by argument, by reflection, by the contemplation of consequences. That is not a rock falling down a hill, indifferent to information, but a mind that updates, that learns, that can be changed by understanding something it didn't understand before. That kind of agency, small, embedded, thoroughly caused, may not be the free will of philosophy textbooks, but it is enough. Enough to make the conversation meaningful. Enough to make growth real. Enough to make the difference between a person who reflects on their behavior and one who doesn't a difference that actually matters. Enough to keep the story worth telling, even knowing it's a story. So here is where the evidence leaves you. Your brain made this decision before you did. The neural machinery that generates your choices was shaped by forces you never chose and cannot fully see. The feeling of authorship, the sense that you, specifically you, are the one steering, is assembled after the fact by a mind that is very good at constructing narratives and presenting them as origins. All of that may be true, and it changes nothing. Not because the science is wrong, but because you are a caused thing that can reflect on its causes. A determined system that can study its own determinism. A story that can read itself and, in the reading, become something it would not have been otherwise. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The question was never whether you have the kind of free will that exists outside physics. That question has an answer, and the answer is probably no. The question is what you do with the agency you actually have. The small, real, thoroughly embedded capacity to pay attention, to reflect, to let understanding change you, to be the kind of caused thing that causes differently because it chose to look. You didn't choose to exist. You didn't choose the brain you were given, the world you were born into, the forces that made you who you are before you were old enough to have an opinion about it. But you are here now, aware, reading. And whatever happens next, that is still being written.